Hello there and welcome. I am Rosanna Lockwood. You're with TalkTV, on radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Prime Time, where we bring you all the stories that matter. On the show tonight.
Be in no doubt, it is time for a change, and we are it. Thank you.
Rishi Sunak makes his big pitch to the Tory faithful, but in it, confirmation the Manchester leg of HS2 is going to be scrapped. Northern leaders now lining up to brand his decision a mistake. Are they right? The shopkeepers forced to defend their empires, as the policing minister says, if you see a shoplifter, arrest them yourself. Also on the programme, the Prime Minister's wife stole the show as she introduced her husband to the stage, and tonight I will be joined by one of the women at the top of the fold, the company behind Akshata Murthy's power suit. Plus, we'll bring you our nightly panel looking at all the other stories making the headlines. This is Prime Time. Breaking the model, ending 30 years of stagnant politics and making the difficult decisions. That was the Prime Minister's promise. Isabel Oakeshott has been at the Conservative Party conference up in Manchester the last few days, back down now here in the studio in London. Isabel, the speech today from PM Rishi Sunak, talking about ending 30 years of stagnation. Is this rebrand going to sell?
Well, I just want to pick up on what the Yorkshire Post guy was saying there. I mean, the reality is that all those voters that came over, those red wall voters that came over to the Tories at the last general election were not coming over because of HS2. They were coming over because of Brexit. And Brexit was one thing that in today's speech, which, by the way, I think was an absolute humdinger, at least presentationally, Brexit was one of the themes of that speech, with the Prime Minister attempting to sort of say, actually, let's not talk it down, you know, making an impassioned defence of Brexit, which I think is probably sorely needed. I've been going to party conference speeches for the best part of 20 years. And often when you come out of the room, you're sort of, as a journalist, you're wondering, what's the line? And actually, there was tons of stuff in that speech. Very much seems to me like an election manifesto. The thing is, they've only got a year in which to even begin to lay the foundations of doing any of these big vision things. Things like banning smoking. Many within the Tory party, I've certainly had quite a few furious text messages from Tory MPs, are horrified by what they see as a real nanny state measure here. So there's a very short frame of time to make good on the ambition in that speech. And in a sense, this was quite the conjuring act. I mean, the Prime Minister stood there trying to persuade voters that as if this is year zero, this is day one, when in fact they've been in power for 13 years. And whether or not he's really going to convince voters that everything has gone before is sort of is someone else's fault, and this is Rishi Sunak starting anew. I mean, it might work in a conference hall, but does that work out on the doorstep? I'm not so sure.
With the electorate as well. And, you know, you point out there was a ton of stuff in the speech, but critics, opponents, Labour have pointed out there's a lot of delays, a lot of dithering in that as well, because he was making all these promises about roads and transport, a lot of which has already been known about for ages, and some of which he's delayed himself, some of these transport projects on road and rail. So when you actually pick through the fine detail, a lot of promises made that have already been made in the past.
And if you look at, for example, one of the big announcements, and a lot of what was in that speech is going to be overshadowed by this huge row over HS2, and you know, that is very polarising. A lot of voters, your last interview was very negative, but there were an awful lot of Tory supporters who think it's fantastic that the Prime Minister has scrapped this project that has spiralled out of all control. You know, the money that is saved is not going to not go to other transport projects. And the real fear was that this thing had just become completely unmanageable. So that has overshadowed a lot of the other substance of the speech. There's a huge announcement in there about the reforms that the Prime Minister would like to see to A-levels. So he basically wants to scrap A-levels, creating this new qualification. I mean, this is pretty revolutionary stuff, asking all 16 to 18-year-olds to do 5 subjects, not 3, and they have to include maths and English. And that's essentially a kind of variation of the international baccalaureate. But when you look at the small print, not coming in until the 2030s.
Exactly, a lot of it off. Just finally, briefly, Isabel, will he be able to withstand the criticism from other people like David Cameron, for example, on the HS2 decision?
Well, I think it's pretty unseemly for former prime ministers to come out and make life difficult for their successors right after a conference speech. Cameron wouldn't have liked that. I don't think that Rishi Sunak is going to take too much attention off that. He will have been prepared for a bit of a firestorm over the next few days. It'll blow over.
I mean, talk about unseemly. You've got former PMs all over the joint saying things the last few days.
We have indeed, yeah.
Isabel Oakeshott, down from Manchester for us. Thank you so much. Well, moving on to some footy now. Some good news. England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, all of them, all of us, we've all won the right to stage the Euro 2028 football championships. Good news indeed. The bid has succeeded because Turkey dropped its bid and, if we host it, likely to provide a boost to our economies of an estimated £2.6 billion. Billion. Let's get that right, shall we? 2.6 billion. Also today, in an unprecedented decision, FIFA has decided to stage the 2030 World Cup, get this, across 3 continents and 6 countries. Matches are going to happen in South America, Europe and Africa. Now, critics, I'd say me included, say this is an unusual decision. Perhaps it's all about money, billions being spread across the globe, people being forced to fly across 3 continents, of course, for a match. Extraordinary. Joining me now to discuss all of this, sports writer for GQ magazine, Andy Mitten. Andy, have let's start with that World Cup one, because that is, to me, bizarre. What's going on? Oh. We'll come back to you, Andy, shortly. What's with it? I mean, he was smiling there, so you clearly heard me going on my rail about the football. Let's see if he's back with us. Andy, have I gone out of left field here saying this is a really weird decision to do the World Cup 2030 across 3 continents?
Yeah, it's very unusual. It's unprecedented. Uruguay staged that first World Cup, so they were always really big on having a competition in 2030. Morocco has bid for several World Cups as well. Spain has been interested. It is a trend. It's moving away from the single country model of hosting tournaments. We saw Poland and Ukraine hosting Euro 2012. We see with the next World Cup going across Canada, the United States and Mexico. And we're seeing with the news today that Euro 2028 is almost certain to be right across the UK plus the Republic of Ireland. So it shares the cost burden, because not all of these competitions make money. The last European Championships was spread all around Europe. I travelled to 9 different countries, I think. It lost money, partly because it was happening during COVID times. But if the conditions are right, such as for France, Euro 16, which I was also at, then it can be a real boost for the economy, for hotels, for tourism. And there's an increase in sophistication in the football tourism market. If you go back to Euro 96, a lot of the stadiums in England were half full. It's hard to believe now, because if a European Championship was put in now, I'm sure that all the games would sell out. So it's changed a lot. Budget airlines help, more hotels, better infrastructure, and football has become even more popular.
Yeah, you make an interesting point about spreading the cost then, and then that versus the money it brings in from the tourism, etc. For the Euro 2028, 10 grounds have been selected. I won't list them all, but you're looking at places like Glasgow's Hampden Park, Cardiff's Principality Stadium, Dublin's Aviva Stadium, Wembley in London. Will we see a good level of collaboration, do you think, by all the home nations and Ireland?
I think so. I think it's a form of soft power, and I think it's a good thing. It's football. It brings joy to people. I've watched football in every single one of those stadiums, apart from the one in Belfast, because it's yet to be built. They're all football hotbeds. And Cardiff, Glasgow, Dublin, they're used to dealing with big numbers of tourists. I watched Manchester United play in Dublin only a month ago, 55,000 people there. The stadiums now are modern. This is a far cry from the early 90s, when a lot of the stadiums were decrepit, they were aged. England didn't host a major tournament from the 1966 World Cup until Euro 96. That wasn't a huge success. People remember it now with very rose-tinted spectacles, but the stadiums were half empty. I'm convinced now that the stadiums right across the UK and the Republic of Ireland will be full. And it's not just about the game. You know, Germany might play in Belfast. They'll take 15,000 fans. They'll have a great time socially. And this is happening more and more across the continent and across several continents looking at the World Cup competitions.
All right, sold. You've sold me on that. You may have even sold me on this 2030 idea as well, Andy. Thanks so much for making time to speak to us, Andy Mitten, sports journalist. Next here on Prime Time, we'll go behind the scenes of the bid to save high street chain Wilko. Stay with us. Well, welcome back. Time now for our primetime panel to dissect some other interesting stories that have caught our eye today. Joining me this evening is consumer affairs journalist Harry Kind and former Downing Street head of press Giles Kenningham. First up tonight, we're going to be talking wind. A Canadian investment firm, Brookfield, set to buy one of the UK's largest renewable developers of wind farms and £1 billion boost for the country's onshore wind industry. This deal, of course, coming after some recent setbacks. Other developers warned of a challenging environment for wind power because of rising costs. Well, $1 billion from the Canadians into something in the UK always feels like a good thing, Harry.
Can't hurt, can it?
Yeah.
You know, we should be at the forefront of renewable technology. We've got so much in the way of natural resource, so much wind, the biggest tidal reaches in the world. If you're going down to the Severn, you're seeing tides that you won't find anywhere else in the world, but we're not really taking advantage of them. £1 billion would certainly help make that financially viable. And this can be the technology that could give us some reliability. The more we invest, the more reliable it becomes, the more we can spread it out across wind, across solar, across tidal. Investing in renewables will mean that we can get rid of the 38% of electricity generated by gas and boost that 25% that's made by wind at the moment and try and switch those around a bit.
Yeah, well, we were speaking to the CEO of S&G earlier on in the show, Gas Distribution Network in the UK, and he's obviously been outspoken given his position about using more of the gas that is under the ground. Depends who you speak to in this country, what their interests are in, Giles, of course, as well. But, you know, there's the part of investing in infrastructure in the UK, investing in our industry and getting things powering, you know, creating jobs. But there's also red tape, regulation and political decisions about onshore wind.
Yeah, I mean, and on the surface, everyone's saying this is a great thing, but should a foreign company be coming in to be investing in our wind energy? What about energy security after everything that's happened in Ukraine and the whole issue about being too reliant on Russia on gas? I actually think it's pretty damning that we've had to have a foreign company come in, and should it even be allowed? I mean, I think we're going to touch on China later on. They're quite a trailblazer in this. They don't allow any foreign companies into the market when it comes to industries like this. And you could argue that it's critical for national security, national infrastructure.
I mean, I hear that argument, but could we do it without £1 billion coming in from outside? Well,
the question is why because it sounds like they needed the money, they needed the cash injection. Why are we in this situation in the first place? Is it too much red tape and regulation? And should there be perhaps more government grants or cash injections from the government going into this, given that it is the future and we want to become more self-sufficient?
Yeah,
absolutely. Although I'm not too worried about Canada, you know, building a backdoor to our wind turbines to shut them off should we end up in some kind of conflict. We are going to need this kind of foreign investment, but absolutely we need to have this kind of homegrown investment too, and that's probably going to come from the government if you're thinking about anything bigger than a wind turbine, particularly nuclear power.
Yeah, I mean, look at it. Our Jaguar Land Rover is owned by Tata. You know, some of Britain's biggest brands are now owned by outside interests. So I hear your point about keeping things onshore, keeping things British, especially when you come to security issues. But is there enough money? Is there enough investment in Britain into British brands? I mean, is it...
Well, I think, you know, you raise a fair question. In a post-Brexit world, we're still going to be seen to be open for business, encourage people to come here. So it's a fine line. I just think an industry like this, which is about energy security, I think perhaps different rules apply.
OK. Well, it would also require us to be able to build onshore wind, which, of course, requires a bit of loosening of red tape, which has been promised at that level. But it is a very political issue as well. Not everyone likes the turbines. Let's move on to our second story. A company started by the founder of ChatGPT has been accused of espionage after scanning people's eyeballs in exchange for cryptocurrency or a sort of digital ID. A report by Kenyan MPs claiming WorldCoin, founded by OpenAI Chief Executive Sam Altman, is a, quote, threat to statehood. This is actually a particularly interesting story because You know, a lot of us can understand what ChatGPT is about now and tech and things like that. The idea of scanning eyeballs. You know, we get scanned at the supermarket now, our faces. But this one, Kenyans particularly were worried about this because there were long queues of people, they would say, being induced to have their eyeballs scanned for up to $50 as a reward. And, you know, you couldn't even work out whether some of them were perhaps children in the queue.
Yeah, and, you know, this is 1984 if George Orwell was a tech bro. This is people being... you know, given a trade for this kind of magic coin in exchange for scanning your eyeballs and giving you an ID. The coin doesn't necessarily have any value. It's part of this kind of cryptocurrency. It requires people to be signed up en masse for this to be something which is worth pursuing. And it's scary that they are, you know, pursuing people who might not be able to consent to this fully before they then rolled it out to the rest of the world.
This programme has been trialled in other countries as well, but I do find it encouraging as well, Giles, that Kenyan MPs stood up for this and said, actually, we're not having this, because obviously a lot of criticism about tech that comes from especially Western democracies, rich countries, and then going into countries in the African continent. You know, Kenya is a successful economy within the African continent. However, there could be some exploitation issues going on with these kinds of tests.
Yeah, I mean, on the surface, it sounds very draconian, very big brother. Snooping. I suppose it depends on who do you trust with this information. Now, we are going to have the ongoing issue of identity theft coming up again and again. So I think part of their rationale for doing this was to guard against that. And how could they safeguard against that? So the theory and the motivation behind it looks fair, but it depends on how secure is that information, how is it going to be used? And yeah, are the people willingly signing up for it?
Well, let's talk about China then. You mentioned it earlier, Giles, because China, when it comes to privacy and data, obviously raises a lot of questions. And Apple has now bowed to Chinese censors, agreeing to ban unapproved apps. What this essentially means is that apps like Facebook, X and YouTube are all going to be prohibited. They won't be available on iPhones in China from the App Store. Now, Chinese iPhones using a VPN, people have been using that in China. That has been done millions of times. Authorities have been trying to close that loophole. Now it seems they've succeeded to get Apple to bow to pressure. And I find this interesting. I used to live in Dubai, where a lot of apps are banned as well. And hearing these tech giants actually bowing down to the desires, what do you think it means in the longer term?
Well, I mean, the largest market for iPhones now isn't America, it's China. So it's kind of no wonder that they have had to basically give up and say, all right, fine, you can, you know, to a certain extent, take control of our platforms here. It's going to make it harder for news to spread of when we saw the kind of mini uprisings around the zero COVID regulations. That may well not have been able to kind of get out there and spread amongst, you know, activists if it weren't for apps like YouTube being accessed via VPNs. So it is concerning. We've never seen really an authoritarian state with quite so much power and technology and money all bundled up into one package. Who knows what they'll be able to do? I
mean, but it's not the first time we've seen a government putting pressure on something like X. Turkey's done it before in elections, Giles.
Yeah, I mean, I was just surprised this hadn't happened sooner, to be quite obvious, given the way the Chinese government acts in terms of sort of closing down free speech. I think I read online that 19% of Apple's revenue comes from China. So for them, it's clearly just a business calculation, isn't it? Like, it's a no-brainer, probably. But it does bring, you know, to your point, it does raise the question of cultural sensitivities in different markets and the choices businesses make. But obviously, they sort of see the market as too big to run away from.
Yeah, you know, and the government's put the pressure on the companies. You hope the companies won't bow to it, but ultimately they do these commercial decisions. Harry Kine, Giles Kenningham, thank you very much for joining us this evening. That is all we have time for tonight. Thank you for watching Piers Morgan Uncensored. Coming up next, we'll be back here same time tomorrow with Prime Time. Good night.